Your support doesn't disappear into the algorithm. It goes straight into making episodes, elevating smart voices, and building the kind of podcast that actually practices what it preaches.
Stars and stripes, dumpster fire vibe. Come on. All American wide. All American wide. All American wide. Ask yourself the American why.
Welcome to All American Why, the show for excessive thinkers. Every week we ask not just what Americans believe, but why. Today's question has shaped our politics, our courts, our economy, and even what many of us watch on TV. Why do Americans trust punishment more than rehabilitation? And what is the prison industrial complex? At first glance, these sound like questions for lawyers, criminologists, or even politicians. They're not. They're questions for all of us. Whether you've been inside a courtroom or not, you pay for the criminal justice system. You vote for the people who shape it. You live in communities affected by it. And chances are you've already formed opinions about prisons, prosecutors, and crime. Maybe those opinions come from personal experience, or maybe they came from the news, or maybe they came from watching Law and Order too much. But seriously, if aliens landed on the earth and they judged humanity solely by our streaming habits, they'd probably conclude that half of us solve murders and the other half commit them. That is a slight exaggeration, but really, if there is a documentary involving a cult, a scam, a murder, or for maximum entertainment value, all three rolled into one, my husband and I are probably already watching it. As the host of My Favorite Murder, a really great podcast like to say, stay sexy and don't get murdered. Crime fascinates us because it forces us to wrestle with some of the hardest questions any society can ask. How do we balance justice with mercy, accountability with redemption, safety with freedom, and what should happen when someone causes real harm to another human being? These are questions that aren't new. They've been around probably as long as civilization itself. For thousands of years, societies have searched for ways to respond to crime. Ancient civilizations relied on fines, restitution, exile, corporal punishment, and sometimes execution. Prisons existed, but they usually weren't the punishment. They were temporary holding places where people waited for trial or sentencing. The idea that someone would spend years behind bars as the punishment is actually relatively modern. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reformers in Europe and the United States proposed something revolutionary. Instead of simply inflicting pain, what if society created places where offenders could reflect on what they had done, receive an education, learn a trade, and eventually return to society as better citizens? That's actually where the word penitentiary comes from, penitence. The original goal wasn't simply punishment, it was transformation. That may sound strange today because most of us don't picture prison as a place of personal growth. We picture concrete walls, razor wire, locked steel doors, and orange jumpsuits. Somewhere along the way, America's conversation about prisons shifted from asking, how do we help people change, to asking, how do we make sure people are punished? Now, to be fair, that shift didn't happen for no reason. Crime is real and victims are real. Violence creates lasting trauma, not only for the victims, but also for families, neighborhoods, and entire communities. There are absolutely people who belong in prison. Someone who commits murder, repeatedly commits violent crimes, sexually assaults another person, abuses children, or continues to pose a serious threat to others may need to be separated from society to protect innocent people. That's one of the most important responsibilities government has. So today's conversation isn't about whether prisons should exist at all. They should. The harder question is how we use them. Should prison primarily punish? Should it deter others from committing crimes? Should it protect society by removing dangerous offenders? Should it rehabilitate? Can it realistically accomplish all of those goals all at the same time? Those questions become even more important when we look at America's criminal justice system today. The United States is home to about 4% of the world's population, yet it incarcerates roughly 1 out of 5 incarcerated people worldwide. Although incarceration rates have declined from their peak in the late 2000s, the United States still imprisons people at a far higher rate than most other democratic nations. Millions more live under probation or parole, meaning the criminal justice system extends far beyond prison walls. How did we get here? Did Americans suddenly become more violent than everyone else? No. Did one president build this system? No. Did one political party? No. America's criminal justice system was built over generations through thousands of decisions made by legislators, governors, judges, prosecutors, presidents, and ultimately, yes, the voters. Some of those decisions undoubtedly made communities safer. Others produced consequences that we're still debating today. And perhaps the most important question isn't about how many people go to prison, it's how many people leave prison and never come back. Researchers call that recidivism, and it's one of the most important ways we measure whether the justice system is achieving its ultimate purpose. Because if prison exists to make communities safer, then success shouldn't simply be measured by how many people we incarcerate. It should also be measured by how many future crimes we prevent, how many future victims never had to experience tragedy, and how many people return to society determined never to enter a courtroom again. That's the question we'll keep coming back to throughout today's conversation. How do we create safer communities? To answer it, we first need to understand how America built the largest incarceration system in the democratic world. And like so many stories in American history, it begins with a complicated mix of fear, politics, race, changing public attitudes, and a nation trying to solve a very real problem. To understand why Americans trust punishment as much as we do today, we have to go back about 60 years, because the story isn't simply about prisons. It's about fear, politics, race, addiction, economics, and many other things. Beginning in the 1960s, violent crime increased dramatically across much of the United States. Homicides rose, robberies became more common, drug use became more visible, particularly heroin in urban areas and later crack cocaine in the 1980s. Many neighborhoods genuinely became less safe, and Americans noticed. If you lived through that era, you probably remember it. Parents worried about letting their children walk to school, businesses installed bars over their windows, evening news broadcasts often opened with violent crimes, drug raids, or gang activity. For many Americans, the fear reflected what they were seeing in their own communities. When people were afraid, they expected their government to respond. And so politicians did exactly that. President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971. He described drug abuse as public enemy number one. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller championed mandatory prison sentences for many drug offenses, even with people who had no history of violence. President Ronald Reagan dramatically expanded federal drug enforcement during the 1980s, and Congress increased penalties for drug crimes. In the 1990s, President Bill Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, commonly known as the 1994 Crime Bill, which funded additional police officers, prison construction, and tougher sentencing initiatives. Meanwhile, states across the country adopted mandatory minimum sentencing laws, truth in sentencing requirements that reduced parole opportunities, and three-strike laws that required significantly longer prison terms for repeat offenders. Again, notice something. It wasn't the work of one person or one politician or one political party. Republicans and Democrats alike supported many of these policies because they reflected what many voters wanted at the time: safer streets, less violence, and stronger consequences for crime. Many of these policies likely prevented crimes by removing dangerous offenders from society. However, Others have been criticized for contributing to overcrowded prisons, disproportionately long sentences for non-violent offenses, and significant racial disparities. That brings us to one of the most difficult chapters in this story, race. It is absolutely impossible to understand the American criminal justice system without acknowledging the role that race has played throughout our history. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime. During Reconstruction, many Southern states adopted black codes that criminalized behaviors such as vagrancy and unemployment. Yes, unemployment was a crime. Thousands of newly freed black Americans were arrested and forced into convict leasing systems, where incarcerated people were leased to private companies to perform dangerous labor under brutal conditions. Many historians view convict leasing as one way forced labor continued after slavery formally ended. Later came Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, unequal educational opportunities, the civil rights movement, the war on drugs, etc., and sentencing policies that researchers have argued disproportionately affected communities of color, particularly the sentencing disparity that once treated crack cocaine offenses far more harshly than powder cocaine offenses, despite the drugs being pharmacologically similar. At the same time, many criminologists point out that communities of color have also experienced disproportionately high rates of victimization. Residents of those neighborhoods often ask for more policing, not less, because they wanted their families protected. That's what makes this conversation so difficult. Communities can simultaneously experience over-policing and under-protection at the same time. Understanding that complexity doesn't require agreeing on every policy. It simply requires acknowledging that history rarely fits neatly into partisan talking points. By the early 2000s, the United States had become the world's largest incarcerator. Although crime rates had fallen significantly from their peaks in the early 1990s, prison populations remained extraordinarily high. Since around 2008, incarceration has gradually declined, but the United States continues to incarcerate people at one of the highest rates in the entire world. Here's another fact that surprises many people. Television has convinced us that criminal justice revolves around dramatic jury trials. It doesn't. If you've watched enough courtroom dramas, you think that every case ends with an emotional closing argument, a surprise witness, or someone dramatically pointing across the courtroom and yelling, "There's the guy, he did it." Real life is far less cinematic. Enjoying the show? Help us keep asking the questions Thanksgiving dinner tries to avoid. Support the podcast or explore sponsorship opportunities at www.allamericanwhypodcast.com. More than 90% of criminal convictions in the United States actually come from guilty pleas rather than jury trials. That means that the vast majority of cases are resolved through negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys, subject to judicial approval. But this also explains why prosecutors have so much influence. When people hear district attorney, they often picture someone standing in court arguing before a jury. Of course, that is part of the job, but it's only a small part. District attorneys and their deputies make thousands of decisions every year, long before anyone enters a courtroom. They decide whether charges should be filed, what charges are appropriate, whether diversion programs should be offered, whether treatment should be considered, and what plea arguments best serve justice. Imagine two people arrested on the same day. One is leading a fentanyl trafficking organization while carrying illegal firearms. The other developed an opioid addiction after being prescribed pain medication following a workplace injury and is now arrested for possession. Both broke the law. Should they receive the same response, though? Most Americans would probably say no. That's because justice isn't simply about deciding whether someone violated the law. It's about deciding what response is most likely to protect society, hold the offenders accountable, and reduce future harm. These decisions are extraordinarily difficult, and they bring us to one of the most misunderstood phrases in modern criminal justice: the prison industrial complex. Because despite the name, it isn't really about prisons alone. It's one of those phrases that tends to end conversations before they begin. For some people, it's shorthand for everything that's wrong with the criminal justice system. For others, it sounds like an exaggerated political slogan. The reality is, as is often the case, it is more complicated and nuanced. Let's start with what the prison industrial complex is not. It is not simply private prisons. That's probably the biggest misconception. Private prisons receive a great deal of media attention, but they house only a minority of incarcerated people in the United States. Most people who are incarcerated are actually held in publicly operated state prisons, federal prisons, county jails, and local correctional facilities. So if the overwhelming majority of prisons are publicly run, why do scholars, journalists, and advocates use the phrase prison industrial complex? It's because prisons don't exist in isolation. A prison isn't simply a building full of cells, it's an entire ecosystem. Someone has to design it, build it, the taxpayers fund its operation, correctional officers work there every day, doctors, nurses, psychologists, teachers, counselors, etc. They all play essential roles. Technology companies provide security systems, surveillance cameras, electronic locks. Companies provide uniforms, mattresses, food, healthcare supplies. Local governments budget for operations. State legislatures appropriate funding. Judges sentence people there. Prosecutors seek incarceration in some cases. Entire rural communities sometimes depend on correctional facilities as major employers. In other words, incarceration is not simply a legal system. It's an entire economic system. That's the basic idea behind the phrase prison industrial complex. It describes the interconnected network of public institutions, private companies, government funding, labor, and political decisions that surround incarceration. It does not require believing there's a grand conspiracy or that everyone involved benefits from keeping prisons full. Rather, it encourages us to examine how incentives shape public policy and how institutions evolve over time. One area where these competing perspectives become especially clear is prison labor. Prison labor has existed in various forms throughout American history, and it remains one of the most debated aspects of incarceration today. Supporters argue that meaningful work provides structure, responsibility, job training, and purpose. Many correctional facilities offer vocational education, manufacturing, food service, maintenance, landscaping, firefighting, apprenticeship opportunities. Some formerly incarcerated people credit these programs with helping them develop skills they later use to find employment after they're released. Critics acknowledge those potential benefits, but they raise different concerns. They argue that incarcerated workers are often paid very low wages, have limited bargaining power, and sometimes produce goods or provide services that generate significant economic value for governments or private contractors. They also point to the historical connection between convict leasing after the Civil War and modern debates over prison labor, arguing that history should inform current policy discussions. Prisons are expensive. State and local governments spend tens of billions of dollars each year operating prisons and jails. Housing a single incarcerated person can cost taxpayers tens of thousands of dollars annually, and considerably more for older adults or people requiring extensive medical care. This is an enormous public investment. So what is the purpose of prison? If the answer is simply punishment, then perhaps success is measured by the certainty and consistency of the punishment. But if the purpose also includes protecting society, reducing future crime, helping victims, preventing future harm, our definition of success becomes much broader. Remember recidivism? If someone enters prison, serves their sentence, and commits another violent crime shortly after release, it's worth asking whether the system actually accomplished everything we hope it would. On the other hand, if someone leaves prison, finds stable housing, secures employment, reconnects with family, receives treatment for addiction or mental illness, and never commits another crime, that's a success not only for that individual, but for every potential victim who never has to experience the harm that they might otherwise have occurred. Ultimately, the prison industrial complex isn't simply about prisons. It's about incentives. And incentives matter because they influence how systems behave. The real question isn't whether prisons should exist. It's whether every part of the system is aligned around the same ultimate goal: creating safer communities. And that leads to perhaps the most important question of all. When does punishment work, and when does rehabilitation work better? So far, we've explored where prisons come from, how the United States built the world's largest incarceration system, and what people mean when they talk about the prison industrial complex. Now we arrive at the question that sits at the heart of this entire conversation. Does punishment actually make us safer? The answer is yes and no. That probably isn't the satisfying answer you're hoping for, but it's the honest one. It's kind of like the famous lawyer answer, it depends. For some people, prison unquestionably protects society. If someone is a serial murderer, a violent sexual predator, a terrorist, or someone who repeatedly commits serious violent crimes, incarceration removes an immediate threat from the community. Criminologists call this incapacitation, and it works in the most basic sense. Someone who is incarcerated cannot commit another violent crime against the public because they're behind bars. The reality is that America's prisons house an incredibly diverse population. Some people have committed horrific acts of violence. Others are serving time for robbery, burglary, fraud, drug trafficking, weapons offenses, or repeated property crimes. Many struggle with addiction. Many live with untreated mental illness. Some entered prison unable to read proficiently. Others served in the military, experienced significant trauma, or spent years in foster care before ever entering the justice system. None of these experiences excuse criminal behavior, and millions of people experience trauma without committing crimes. Millions struggle with addiction without harming others. But if our goal is to prevent future crime, understanding why people offend becomes just as important as we decide how to punish them. That's where rehabilitation enters the conversation. For some people, rehabilitation sounds like the opposite of accountability. Instead, rehabilitation asks a practical question. What can we do today that makes another victim less likely tomorrow? Justice is rarely a one-size-fits-all. That's why many prosecutors, judges, probation officers, and treatment professionals increasingly talk about evidence-based practices. Instead of asking only what punishment fits this crime, they also ask what intervention is most likely to reduce future offending. Over the past several decades, researchers have found encouraging evidence for several approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps many participants recognize harmful thinking patterns and develop decision-making skills. Substance use treatment can reduce future drug-related offending for many people with addiction. Educational programs, including GED completion, vocational training, and college courses, have consistently been associated with lower rates of reincarceration. Stable housing, employment, and strong family connections also improve the chances that someone successfully rebuilds their life after release. None of these approaches is a cure-all, but together they provide a growing body of evidence that rehabilitation can improve public safety for many offenders. Other countries have approached this challenge differently. Nations such as Norway, Germany, Finland, and the Netherlands generally place greater emphasis on education, vocational training, normalized living conditions, and preparing incarcerated people for release. Their systems differ dramatically from the United States in population, culture, healthcare, social services, and legal traditions. So it's not a perfect direct comparison. Still, they remind us that incarceration can be designed in different ways, and those differences are worth studying when the goal is reducing future crime. Perhaps the most overlooked fact in this entire conversation is this: nearly 95% of people sentenced to prison will eventually be released. That means almost everyone who enters prison will one day return to a neighborhood, apply for a job, reconnect with family, shop at a grocery store, and become part of a community again. The question isn't whether they'll come home. The question is, who will they be when they come home? Imagine leaving prison after 10 years. Technology has changed. Your children have grown up. Your parents are older. Your work history has a decade-long gap. Finding housing is difficult. Finding employment is even harder. Starting over isn't impossible, but it's incredibly difficult. That's why experts spend so much time talking about re-entry. Re-entry isn't about rewarding criminal behavior. It's about recognizing reality. If someone is going to return to our communities anyway, shouldn't we do everything reasonably possible to reduce the likelihood that they create another victim? Research consistently shows that stable housing, employment, family support, access to treatment, and community connections reduce the likelihood that many formerly incarcerated people will reoffend. None of these guarantee success, but together they improve the odds, and improving the odds matters. So how can America be smarter on crime? How do we hold people accountable? How do we protect victims? How do we prevent future crime? And how do we recognize that every case is different while still applying the law fairly and consistently? And perhaps most importantly, how do we build a justice system that earns the public's trust? Those aren't easy questions. Fortunately, today's guest has spent much of his career wrestling with them. Mike Schmidt served as the elected district attorney for Multnomah County during one of the most turbulent periods in Oregon's modern history. He took office just months before the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped the justice system. He led the office through the murder of George Floyd and the nationwide protests that followed, the rise of fentanyl, increasing homelessness, staffing shortages throughout the legal system, and intense public debate over prosecution, policing, and criminal justice reform. To some, he became a national symbol of progressive prosecution. To others, he became the face of policies they believed were making Portland less safe. This isn't about campaign ads, and it's certainly not about social media. It's understanding how prosecutors actually make decisions, what the public often misunderstands about district attorneys, when prison is unquestionably necessary, and when rehabilitation better serves public safety and becomes a smarter criminal justice system in America. Because before we can decide whether Americans trust punishment before rehabilitation, we have to understand why. I'm Michael Jonas, and this is All American Why. Mike Schmidt, welcome to the show. Did you know that Mike has a podcast too? This guy's Mike. Yeah, it's really good. I'm not just saying that because you're saying it in front of me.
You're sweet.
True. Mike Schmidt, thank you for being on the podcast.
Hey, Michael Jonas, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Does anybody ever call you Michael?
My mom, and only when I'm in trouble.
Yeah. So we have Mike and Michael.
Yeah, there you go. It works.
Before we get into policy and, all these other questions that I have, I wanted to know more about you. I wanted our listeners to know more about you. So how'd you grow up? How did you become, an attorney?
Yeah, I appreciate that because, I think in a lot of ways, my origin story kind of led to my professional career. And that, I wasn't necessarily anticipating that, or that wasn't my goal, but my experience is kind of, like most of us, shaped who I am and what I believe. So I grew up in upstate New York, outside of Syracuse is where I got started. Republican, very Republican spot, conservative, like many states like Oregon, you got New York City that's super blue. And so that makes the entire state blue. But really the rest of the state, the more rural areas can be very conservative. And so I grew up in a more conservative spot in upstate New York, went to Vassar College. And here's a funny anecdote. I showed up at Vassar College and I had a Bob Dole placard with me for my dorm
Bob
room.
Dole. Is that how he talks? Bob Dole. People
Bob
try
Dole.
to do that impression.
So I had a Bob Dole placard with me and my roommates were like, dude, that's so awesome. Like they thought I was ironic. They thought I was being funny, but I was like, being genuine. My social studies teacher in high school told us all to register as Republicans when we became of age to register to vote. And the rationale is actually, maybe rationale that is not nefarious, makes sense. She's like, look, everybody votes Republican here. So if you want a voice in actual politics, then you have to register Republican, because if you register Democrat, you're not going to have a voice in any local politics whatsoever. So I was like, well, that makes sense to me. I'll be a Republican. I got my Bob Dole placard. I go to Vassar College, one of the most liberal institutions in the country, and show up. And luckily my roommates thought I was being funny. And so I got a real education in so many ways at Vassar College. From there, I taught high school or middle school and high school in New Orleans. And that was my first real job. And I did Teach for America, which, for some folks can be a little bit of a controversial program in terms of, sending these saviors from liberal institutions to go, service the most impoverished communities. And instead of actually fixing and investing in their school systems, it can be viewed as kind of a Band-Aid solution. On the other flip side of that, though, is you send young people who are bright and who are motivated, and they go in and they, hopefully do a good job with the students, and they also learn and they take those experiences with them for the rest of their life. And that was me. I had incredible experiences. All my students were Black. And, obviously I'm not. And so going down there and it was my first time being not in the majority in a space, right? In a community, in a space. And that was a very important experience for me. And then I got to really understand what my students' lives were like as their teacher. And I had students who were victims of crime. I remember one time I was teaching a lesson and I asked my students, I said, hey, who here knows somebody who has been, victim of a violent crime, of being shot? Every single hand in the classroom went up. And I was like, so much so I was like, I don't mean like, on TV. I'm like, really know a person. And every one of my students had that life experience of knowing personally a human who had been shot.
That's wild.
If you'd asked me that in upstate New York, maybe one kid raises their hand out of our entire school, and so these kids were living with a level of reality and challenge and obstacle that I didn't have to face growing up. They were victims of crime. They lived around violent crime. They sometimes themselves ended up in the system, in the criminal justice system. And I had a really tragic story about that. They had family members who were incarcerated and who were no longer part of their community anymore. And so that was my first real taste of things aren't going right. Like when growing up again in upstate New York, we'd run from the local sheriff for fun. Like it was like a game. We would jump in the little hotel pool and then jump back out, and the sheriff would come and we'd all run and scatter. And my life was never at risk, right?
Yeah.
It was kind of a rite of passage situation. My kids in New Orleans, my students in New Orleans, life or death, completely different scenario. One of my students, one of my favorite students, very outgoing, very energetic. Everybody loved him. One weekend is walking to the corner store to get milk and cereal for his siblings. And he approaches a scene where the police have a man on the ground at gunpoint. And my student's just walking by, and the police turn on him and order him to get down on the ground. And he does. One of the police officers goes over and purports to pull a baggie of marijuana out of his back pocket. And now my 14-year-old student is spending a weekend in solitary confinement because they take him to the adult jail, but because he's a youth, he can't be housed with adults. So they keep him in solitary for an entire weekend, a 14-year-old. When he came back to school, he told me the experience of counting the braids on his head so that he could stay sane while he was going through that. And this student who was outgoing and everybody loved, he came back from that experience and his affect was flat. The joy was out of his eyes. He was just a completely different student. So I left New Orleans in 2005. I moved to Portland. I wanted to become an environmental lawyer. I was going to save the world with a kayak and find polluters and sue them like so many shipwrecked sailors here in Portland. And I got to Lewis and Clark, and I found out that I didn't like environmental law after I was a year and a half in. They had half my money. I got an internship at the district attorney's office, and I thought, here's a place where I can take my experience from New Orleans and I can be the prosecutor. I can be the law that understands what my student's life was like. And I can bring that experience with me. And after 5 years of being in that office, I didn't feel like I was making the difference that I set out to make. I felt like the institution is pretty set in its ways and wasn't actually interested in working on racism in the system or other challenges that a lot of people face. And so I left. I went to the legislature. From the legislature, I went and led the state's Criminal Justice Commission for almost 6 years, which is our state's think tank on criminal justice policy. I got to travel the world in that role. I went to Norway to visit their prison system. I've been to prison systems all over our country. I spent the night in Angola, one of the bloodiest prisons in Louisiana. And I got to talk to people from all over the world and all over our country about what actually works. So when I saw the opportunity to run for district attorney in 2020, I thought to myself, if I really believe these things, if I really believe that we can do things better, we can do things more smart, we can do things that take into account the humanity of everybody we deal with in our system, and we can get better results for public safety, then I have to raise my hand and take this leap. And I did. And I was elected in 2020 through maybe one of the roughest stretches, at least in recent memory, in terms of, a week after I was elected, George Floyd was murdered. The previous DA resigned. We were just starting out in COVID. Our jail had been firebombed in the early protest days, so that wasn't working. And then throughout my tenure, we had, like we did nationally, a massive spike in violent crime. It happened here in Portland. It happened around the country. Gun violence exploded. Fentanyl hit our streets for the first time in a meaningful way. And it was just like kind of crisis after crisis, not enough defense attorneys to work the system. So it was a really challenging tenure. Obviously, I stood for re-election, wasn't re-elected. And now I get to do civil rights work where I'm very privileged to work for the Urban League of Portland.
And podcasting.
That's exactly right.
Not just on our show. You have a great podcast of your own.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Schmidt Show PDX.
For listeners who don't understand what a district attorney is or how that office runs, can you give some insight to that? I think it's really important.
Yeah, it's, this was something that I faced a lot throughout my campaigns is, people were sold this idea that the district attorney controls the crime rate. That policies or actions a district attorney can take would directly lead to crime rising or falling. So I think a lot of people were sold that as a concept, which is just not true. It's not borne out anywhere. There are jurisdictions around our country that have tough on crime prosecutors, and their crime rates are way worse than they are here. There are jurisdictions that have more progressive prosecutors than we have, and their crime rates are way better than here, and vice versa. The crime rate has nothing to do with a prosecutor. But our job, if your listeners think, if you ever watched Law and Order on TV, the thing that most people know is the courtroom work. So you're in the courtroom and you're arguing to the jury, Mike Schmidt, he did X, Y, and Z, and that means that he broke these laws. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, because I proved that to you, you must find Mike guilty. That's the flashy side of what a prosecutor does.
Or breaking down a door.
Yeah,
or calling a judge at 3 a.m. and asking for a warrant.
Yeah, that does happen. That does happen for sure. Less the breaking down doors, but definitely calling judges at 3 a.m. for sure. Prosecutors, so the first step into the criminal justice system really starts with the community. Something happens, an action happens in the community, and somebody decides that they want a criminal justice response. And so they pick up the phone and they might call 911. So, for example, your car gets broken into, which is something that is a more mundane criminal situation, but happens frequently. And it's really disruptive and can be very scary. So you come out to your car in the morning, the glass is on the ground. So you call the police and you say, hey, this is what happened. I need someone to come. The police are the first line of response in that situation. They will come out, they will assess the situation. Obviously, their first concern is safety, but a lot of time the crime has already happened and is gone. So it's not usually a safety situation right away. Now it's an evidence gathering situation. So the police officers are going to, take your statement, take some photos, look what happened, and then hopefully they'll write up a report and hopefully there's an investigative, next step. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen enough in this community. The last time I looked at the police property clearance rates for property crimes, it was around 4%.
Wow.
4%, meaning when I say clearance rates, meaning they make an actual arrest for somebody who committed a property crime. For a property crime that was committed, 4% of the time, they're actually making an arrest. So a lot of times when I was up for re-election, people conflate police and prosecution in their minds as if those are one system, one thing. Now, we work together, but we are not the same thing. The prosecutor has no control over the police. So the police take the report, they gather the evidence. If they are able to make an arrest, they package it all up and they send it to the prosecutor's office. And that's when we first get involved. So an arrest has happened, evidence is gathered. Now an attorney will take that package of evidence and they'll read through it and they will determine, not the police officer, they will determine whether or not legally they have the evidence they need in order to secure a conviction, that they have enough information that they have probable cause, they can believe that they would be successful in securing a conviction. If they have that, then they will file the case. And that's when you actually get charged with a crime. And so the prosecution in this state are who is making the charging decision. Once you're charged with a crime, now you're brought in front of a judge. You'll be what they call arraigned on that crime, which means essentially the judge reads you the charges that you face. You should be assigned a defense attorney, although that's a real challenge in our community right now. We don't have enough defense attorneys. And so, unfortunately, people are going without counsel, which, by the way, is a constitutional right that people have. A lot of your listeners will be familiar, whether they know the name of it or not, with the Miranda warnings, right? Which Miranda was a Supreme Court case a while ago that essentially says you have rights. And we all know it from TV. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can't be held against you. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be appointed to you. That is a constitutional right. And the state of Oregon is failing on supplying people with their defense attorneys, which means those constitutional rights are not being honored currently. But let's say that you get your defense attorney, and now it really is what happens in the system from there is the defense and the prosecution will try to come to a resolution on your case and come to terms with some sort of acceptable arrangement or agreement, usually resulting in a person pleading guilty to at least some charges. A lot of people don't know this. 95% of the cases in our criminal justice system actually don't go to trial. They will end up being resolved via plea agreement. And so there's all kinds of different things in our system that strengthen the prosecutor's hands in terms of being able to extract plea agreements. We could talk about Measure 11, which is our mandatory sentencing system we have here in the state of Oregon, which essentially took the job of sentencing individuals out of judges' hands and put them in prosecutors' hands. So there's all kinds of, whenever you hear somebody talking and touting, hey, let's get tough on crime laws, we need to strengthen these laws, make them more punitive, what you're really doing is you're giving prosecutors more leverage to extract plea agreements, because then only the prosecutors can show you mercy by agreeing to some sort of a reduced sentence. And so, unfortunately, a lot of our system, and locally here in Oregon, but also across the United States, has really over the years moved towards this very punitive style system, which strengthens the hands of prosecutors. So they're a very important actor in our system in terms of policy. Legislators listen to prosecutors. They are frequently not themselves criminal practitioners, so they're scared of the political power of the prosecutor, and they like to avoid that type of controversy. And so you just get tougher and tougher on crime laws, despite the fact that, you know, evidence and research says that this country is an outlier and we've been going the wrong way for a long time.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. I think it's really important. A lot of folks don't really understand it because it's either you didn't go to law school or you've never been in the system or you get it on TV.
Yep.
You're not the stereotypical prosecutor, you know. Can you talk about that, of like when you probably met or continue to meet prosecutors and you look at yourself and you're kind of like, yeah, I do want there to be justice, but I'm not really like this.
Yeah. Well, the good news is, I think you're right. I'm not the stereotypical prosecutor. A traditional prosecutor, like the one we have now, is what you might call a more tough on crime or law and order type prosecutor. People who fundamentally believe that all of society's problems can be solved with a conviction. I don't subscribe to that philosophy. I am a person who, you know, my experience from being a teacher in New Orleans, like I see the tough decisions that actual human beings are faced with every day, and sometimes they make mistakes, but putting them into a system where the likely outcome is that they will continue to commit and be convicted of more crimes over and over and over again is just not a good strategy. So yeah, I'm an outlier. I'm a person who believes that if you really want to change things, you should look at the underlying conditions that somebody's coming from. And where this really kind of got driven home for me was actually when I was a prosecuting attorney on the front lines back in around 2010 or 11 or 12, somewhere around there.
What is time? I don't know 2017 or 2018 from 2024.
I know. Yeah. Well, that especially was a blur. I was in front of a judge here in Multnomah County, a brilliant judge named Michael Marcus. And Judge,
another Michael.
Well, you know, he's got to be brilliant. So Judge Marcus, known for being a guy who really thought deeply about what works, research, what are we trying to accomplish here? So anyway, I was in front of him. I had a case. The person was pleading guilty to whatever the charges were. So now we're at what you call the sentencing phase, right? So we're essentially, the prosecution and the defense are arguing to the judge, what should the sentence be for the conduct that this man's been convicted of? And he was an older gentleman. He was a black gentleman. And, you know, my argument to the judge was essentially, Judge, this guy's been in and out of prison his entire life. And every time he gets released, he commits a new crime. So we got to send him to prison, but not just send him to prison. We got to send him to prison for as long as the law allows. And the judge just looks at me and says, why? And I did what many attorneys do when they're being questioned by the judge. I immediately looked down to my file and started flipping through pages as if the answer was in there, right? I'm trying to buy time in my brain. I'm like, what does he mean? Why? That's the law. The law allows for this sentence. This guy has been committing crimes his entire life. Who better to be sentenced to the most, the harshest punishment? And so I really didn't have a great answer. And the judge says, all right, sit down, prosecutor. I'm done talking to you. So the defense attorney, feeling very good about his case all of a sudden, because, the prosecution's on their heels. He's like, Judge, I can tell you totally get this. My client just needs treatment. He just needs a chance. And if he gets treatment, that's really going to think. And the judge looks at the defense and he's like, why? Your client has failed out of every treatment program the state of Oregon has to offer. And what I took away from that interaction wasn't that there is no right answer, right? Mm-hmm. But the prosecution, me, and the defense were not trying to answer the one question that we should have been trying to answer, which is, what can we actually do to set this human being on a different trajectory than the one he's been on his entire life? How can we actually do something that might meaningfully improve the community's expectation of public safety? But we were just going to our corners and doing our rote thing. And so that was a moment for me that really kind of changed my entire outlook on the way that I wanted to approach things. So from there on, I've always wanted to ask, why are we doing this? Is it going to have the outcomes that we want to have? And I think that's led my philosophy, both at the Criminal Justice Commission and then as a DA. And so, while I was DA, I established a lot of things. We had restorative justice cases. One of the most high-profile restorative justice cases actually was where the police officer was a beneficiary of the restorative justice. We charged a police officer with assaulting a protester. And the protester who was assaulted was agreeable to a restorative justice resolution. And so, she had things that she wanted to hear him say and acknowledge for her healing. And, he chose to participate in that process. And so I dismissed the charges against him because he participated in a restorative justice process, something that I would have done for anybody in the system. But I thought it was particularly meaningful for a police officer because frequently it's police officers who are the biggest critics of these types of programs. So I thought it was poetic that he might be a beneficiary of a philosophical change and shift in the system. Ultimately, of course, the police were against me. And so I guess they didn't see it that way. But those are the types of innovative things that I wanted to try to do. Multnomah County still to this day, although my successor has dismantled a lot of the work that I did during my tenure, we still have the only violent person crime treatment court in the country that I'm aware of. And so this is, again, for people charged with Measure 11 crimes where they are facing long prison sentences. And we started a treatment court. And in fact, Portland State University is just about to publish a research paper on the efficacy of that intervention. Because at least while I was there, and I haven't seen the latest numbers, the recidivism rate for people in that treatment court was around 10%. The recidivism rate, and that term recidivism is a defined term. It means committing a new crime within 3 years of the previous crime. The recidivism rate for people coming out of prison in the state of Oregon is close to 50%.
Oh, wow.
So think about it this way. I like to use the analogy of you've got two airlines you can choose, right? You can choose the airline that crashes 50% of the time or the airline that crashes 10% of the time. Which one are you going to buy a ticket on? Obviously, everybody's buying the 10%, right? Like, yeah, that's a better outcome. Yeah. Well, the 10% outcome means we're not sending this person to prison. We're going to actually work with them. We're going to get them treatment. We're going to work on the underlying challenges that got them there and help them make better decisions in the future. Prison is we're going to send you into a traumatic punishment box and hope you emerge better than when we sent you in, which is not how human brains work. And so, but yet still, if I was to ask the question a different way, this person committed a serious crime. Would you like to give them treatment or send them to prison? The answer would be flipped. Most people would prefer to send that person to prison instead of giving them a shot at treatment, despite the fact that the evidence is clear that the results for public safety are better the other way. So, that's why my philosophy is different, but I'm by far not the only person. It was a movement. There are progressive prosecutors across this country that predated me that I looked to for inspiration. Probably the most prominent is a man out of Philadelphia named Larry Krasner. But my good friend Kim Fox in Chicago was a real trailblazer. Chesa Boudin down in San Francisco, unfortunately got recalled. A lot of us West Coast progressive prosecutors faced really hard times in electoral situations. George Cascone down in LA just lost his reelection campaign. I actually think that has more to do with homelessness than anything else. I think that unfortunately, it's an easy case for the tough on crime crowd to make. Like, just look for yourself at the visual disorder out there. That's because you're a prosecutor. Right. And that's all they have to say. And in people's minds, they're like,
people were acting as if you were giving people fentanyl on the street.
Yeah, but truly they were. There are probably people that believe that, and so it was an easy case to make. But actually, progressive prosecutors, despite some high profile West Coast losses, have been growing across the country. And they're actually growing in suburban and rural areas as more people realize, the United States is an international outlier on how much we rely on punishment. And B, punishment is expensive. Choosing to warehouse people in prisons is expensive. And after a while, you need more prisons because they keep stacking up and you keep adding more and more of them in there. And so it's a one-way ticket to gobbling up public resources, which are the exact same resources that could be used for schools, for hospitals, for the programs that we all depend on. And the prison and carceral system will just gobble all those resources up. And so even in more conservative places, there are prosecutors that they may not call themselves a progressive prosecutor, because probably electorally that would not be a smart move, but they think of and they do a lot of the same things that a lot of us progressives do. So I do see that in the long run, this shift is we are going to win. And I think younger attorneys coming into the system are much more likely to have this type of a philosophy and want to get into the system to see the system change. And so, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that, despite some setbacks for me here in Portland, and Portland's, currently experiencing a setback, and San Francisco and LA, the long-term trajectory is this is where things are going. I think someday we will look back at our criminal justice system and we will liken it to when we were drilling holes in people's heads for lobotomies for mental health care. I mean, it is that type of a barbaric system that is out of step with any kind of research or how things actually work.
Like the podcast? Join the dialogue. You can support the show or partner with us as a sponsor at www.allamericanwhypodcast.com. Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that. And I know that people look at prison in different ways. So some people say protecting society, some people say rehab, some people say a deterrence. So if you see that you end up there, I guess, I want to be clear that you're not saying that nobody should be in prison, because I think when people hear this, they may say, why does a prosecutor believe that nobody should go to prison? And you're not saying that. You're saying that it's not a one-stop shop or throw the book at everyone. So can you kind of explain that nuance, that there's different tools used for different people based on different things?
Yeah, you're right. I'm not an abolitionist. There are people that are, and of course, in a perfect world, we would have the things that we need, and we do a much better job. But I don't know that we ever get to a place where you don't need prisons. There are individuals who are not safe to be in our community at the moment that they might be in. That doesn't mean that they will never be safe to be in our community. That doesn't mean that you can't work on the underlying issues, can be mental health challenges, addiction. There are a lot of things that can get people into prison, just the way people think, growing up in a situation or an environment where violence and crime is normalized. For some people, that's their reality, and so taking them out of that situation and out of society might be necessary, but it doesn't mean they can never come back. So yeah, I am not an abolitionist. I do think that there is a place for people to be removed from society. I also think, though, that the way we treat them when we remove them from society should be with an eye towards getting them back into society. My experience in going to Norway, they had their whole theme or value of their system was humanization and normalization. And they have an entire system where when you are first brought into prison, you're put on the most high security situation. And then you can demonstrate through your actions that you can have more and more freedom to move about the prison. And then you can do things like when I toured one of their wings in one of their prisons, they actually had a kitchen with kitchen knives, steak knives, untethered to the wall, like steak knives. And a bunch of us United States people are like, what is this? Like, we're in prison with people who are convicted of murder.
It's fascinating.
Right now. And there are knives on the table. Like, what is happening? And they're like, oh yeah, the people in this wing have, proven that they can handle this level of freedom. So we allow them to go to the prison commissary, buy whole foods, bring it back, prepare those foods, and then, go about living their life. And so somebody asked, they're like, has anyone ever been stabbed? And the prison guard was like, yeah, that did happen. We had one, I think, like 12 years ago, a person was stabbed. And it was like, wait, one? I mean, here we are in the United States where we would never consider giving people access to knives. And yet the people who are incarcerated in our system fashion them themselves out of things and stab each other on a much more regular basis than apparently what's happening in Norway. And so it just, it's a completely different philosophical way of approaching things. And they will step you back into the community step by step until you're ready. And so in Norway, there are no such things as life sentences. There's no death penalty. The maximum prison sentence you could face at the time when I was there, I don't know if things have changed at all, but when I was there, was 20 years. And the expectations you'll be back into society. And most people, even people convicted of murder, are not anywhere near 20 years in the amount of time they serve, because they are walked back into society step by step, gaining more and more of their freedom. And so the entire focus of the system is rehabilitation. And there are just so many ways that they go about, they think through the environmental design of the facilities. So you walk into a Norwegian prison and you're going to think to yourself, there's a big wall around the perimeter, but you get in the interior and you're like, this looks like a college campus. I mean, it has that feel, and that's intentional. They want people to understand and act like they are in society.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. I mean, what do you say to a family that, one of their kids was murdered by one of those people in a Norway prison? That person gets out within 12, 15, 20 years, and they say, I never get my son back. My son's not here forever. This person's going to be in an environment where they get to have hobbies and do things. I can never see my son again. So I guess my question for you is, how would you explain to that family who lost a child from someone who, murdered the child, who is now walking the street, and they're like, that's the guy who murdered our child, and this person's now out on the street?
Yeah. Well, we spoke to victims and family members in Norway, and so I know what they said, right? I mean, we didn't do a comprehensive. You can't talk to everybody. During my tenure here in Multnomah County, unfortunately, I spoke to a lot of family members who were facing situations like that. I never viewed it as my job as the district attorney to convince them of anything. I was there to listen to them, to really try to understand to the best of my ability what they were going through, to honor that process, that grieving process that they were on. I never would go into a situation and say, hey, I know you just lost your son, but have you thought about this or that, right? It's like, we wanted to give them information about what was going to happen, understand the process, answer any questions, try to relieve any anxiety. But what I would say about that is it's a very Americanized sense of justice, that the more punishment you bestow on this person, the more relief or healing I will receive. And in my experience in talking to victims, both as the district attorney and then in other roles that I've been in, even where people may want retribution, the people who I see experience the most healing are the people who have a more forgiveness centered approach, which is not to say that people need to forgive or anything else, but I've not seen people who were very dead set on punishment receive the relief they thought they were going to receive in exchange for the punishment that they were able to extract.
And here's another one for you.
Yeah.
What about the argument that that person gets out, they do the crime again, so we didn't keep this person longer, so they murder 4 more people? And again, this is me throwing, questions at you and the devil's advocate sort of way.
Well, the funny thing about that question is this question drives me crazy because
you're welcome.
well, because this is why. The way that our system works, the way that the media covers our criminal justice system, the way that people think about this is that sending someone to prison is the punishment that would prevent future things from happening. And yet, as we've already established, 50% of the time, that person will commit another crime. Doesn't mean they're going to commit the same violent crime, but another crime, 50% of the time, right? When we have other interventions that are proven to show a much reduced recidivism rate, this treatment court I was talking about, 10% of the time. And so the thing that drives me crazy is whenever somebody is given one of these treatment interventions, but they mess up and they commit another crime, that's when people are out of their mind. They're like, I can't believe it. See, you gave him treatment and he committed another crime. And that's what you get. That's your liberal philosophy, blah, blah, blah. I'm yet to see the news article that was like, well, the prosecutor sent him to prison and he committed another crime. Boy, that prosecutor really failed, right? Prosecutors and the way the media treats things is as long as they send you to prison, they can't be blamed for the negative outcome that comes afterwards. But if they don't send them to prison, they can be blamed for the negative outcome that comes afterwards. And so in your hypothesis, we send people to prison all the time and 50% of them are going to come out and commit more crimes because prison does not rehabilitate people. It does not make things better. Exposing people to more trauma, traumatized people to more trauma does not usually result in them healing and becoming a different person in society.
Can you describe some of that rehabilitation and what actually works or doesn't work and kind of where we're at with rehabilitation in society?
Yeah, there's a ton of research on this. The most promising therapies and interventions is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a talk therapy kind of modality where you are trying to get at your cognitive thinking that led you into the situation, recognize the patterns that got you, that negative thinking patterns that brought you to the point of making a decision that was antisocial and criminal, and then recognizing those patterns in yourself so that when you see them, you can interrupt them. So it's a lot of kind of mindfulness, awareness, recognizing your own patterns and then breaking those patterns. That's been shown to be the most effective intervention that we have for just criminal thinking. Obviously, there are people that are dealing with acute addiction. And so getting them on a treatment path will also often help with both their thinking patterns and also the motivation that underlies some of the criminality that we see. Mental health is another obviously challenge, that undiagnosed mental health challenges. That's another thing that can really, if that is the underlying reason to the criminality, addressing those issues can really put them. So there are very effective rehabilitation methodologies. And it's a person by person analysis, right? Not everyone's going to need mental health. Not everyone needs addiction. Not everybody needs. So you got to do an individualized assessment with the individual. You have to sit down, learn who they are, learn how they got there, come up with what is the thing and the pattern that got them to the negative outcome. And then you have to address those things. So there's all those ways, or you could just send them to prison and
That's
hope
what I
for
say.
the best.
It sounds like the easier decision has been to send people to prison because they don't have to evaluate someone individually and work through their issues.
Yep. So much easier and less risky for the decision maker. Because again, the Oregonian's not going to write the article about, the DA sent him to prison, but that didn't work. They only write that article about the treatment options.
Can you talk about the prison industrial complex and, public and private prisons and how there's actually people making millions or billions of dollars off of prison?
Yeah. We're fortunate in the state of Oregon that we don't have private prisons. So that is not we also don't have a privatized bail bonds industry in this state. So Oregon actually has done a very good job of keeping that type of corporate incentives out of our system. But certainly nationally, bail bonds is a thriving industry.
In California, you can't drive on a freeway without seeing a bail bond.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so, for people, bail bonds, people might have an idea of what that is. But essentially, when you are charged with a crime, if you are going to be released before your trial, they give you what's called a bond. And a lot of times that's a monetary bond. And so you have to come up with some amount of money. So there's an entire industry nationally around people who will put up the money for you and then charge you money, of course, in exchange for that. And then if you don't show up and they lose their bond, they can mitigate that loss by going and capturing you themselves and bringing you back to the court system. In Oregon, we call that kidnapping. That's against the law. So Oregon's done some things right in that regards. But yeah, a privatized prison system. I mean, I've seen things in some of the southern states. I'll pick on my former state, Louisiana, when I was there in New Orleans. There have been scandal after scandal of how the sheriffs individually get budgets and they can allocate them however they want. And so if they want to feed you moldy food and pocket the balance of the money, and by pocket, I mean literally in their own personal pockets, the balance of the money they didn't spend on feeding the people who are incarcerated. Well, in Louisiana, you can do that, right? That's called efficiency. They're just running an efficient system. So that's one type of almost privatization. But there are actual huge companies, and we see ICE right now working with these massive companies that are standing up these facilities and charging the federal government all kinds of dollars to warehouse people in the most inhumane conditions. If anybody believed that prison was about rehabilitation, talk about a perverse incentive model, because literally if prisons get paid by housing prisoners, they have every incentive for you to commit another crime and come back. So why would a privatized prison ever work on rehabilitating people? That's actually against their business model. So, nationally where that's an issue, I mean, it's a horrible thing. And we just see how much money we waste on paying those corporations.
Doesn't seem very Christ-like either, right, Mike?
Yeah, no, but it's certainly not.
So if you could change 3 things about America's criminal justice system tomorrow, what would they be?
The biggest headwinds to change, I think, is public belief in a few things, in a few fundamental things. People believe that punishment deters people from committing crime. If we could just change that, we could change our entire system. I believe in deterrence to some extent and for some people. But I think the trap that people fall into is they think they use themselves as the hypothetical case. And so, I'm Mike Schmidt. I have a job. I have family. I'm in society. I do these things. I'm like, of course I would never commit a crime.
Beekeeper?
Yeah, I'm a beekeeper. I'm a podcaster. Of course I wouldn't commit a crime because, boy, I don't want to go to jail. I could lose my job. I could lose this. I could lose that. And so I'm like, yeah, deterrence works. Deterrence works great for me, right? Mike Schmidt, because I have a lot to lose. But the people who end up in our criminal system are frequently not the people that have a lot to lose. If you spend any day in the Multnomah County Circuit Court and watching arraignments, you will see poor person after poor person after addicted person after mentally ill person. That is who is in our criminal system. 95% of the people that we are prosecuting are destitute. They qualify for public defenders because they don't meet the minimum thresholds of income. They have acute addiction and mental health challenges. That's who we're criminalizing. And so this idea of building a system that deters me, Mike Schmidt, law degree, all these things, and thinking that that will work for other people is just fundamentally flawed logic, but it's logic that we all fall into. This idea, and I heard it all the time when I was DA. They're like, but Mike, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, so, okay, here's point number 2. We need to get biblical references and sports metaphors out of our criminal justice policy making. 3 strikes, you're out makes a ton of sense for baseball. It is horrible criminal justice policy. I met a man in Alabama. I talked to a prosecutor in Alabama, and we were having this conversation. He was like, oh yeah. He's like, actually tomorrow I'm going to go into prison. I'm going to visit a guy that I prosecuted. I sent to prison for life. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. You have a relationship like that? He's like, yeah, he's not a bad guy. He's like, I'm rooting for him. I hope he gets paroled. And I was like, well, what sent him to prison for life? And he's like, well, it was his 3rd strike.
What was it? Stealing a loaf of bread?
It was a purse snatching.
Yeah.
Purse snatching. So immediately I thought to myself, okay, in Alabama, you can be sent to prison for life for purse snatching. So if deterrence works, you would imagine the crime rate in Alabama, which is much more severe, the punishment is much more severe, would be lower than it is here, right? I mean, if deterrence works, if punishment works, then why would you ever risk going to prison for life over snatching a purse? Well, actually, their crime rate's worse than it is here.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the same thing. There are states that have the death penalty and states that don't have the death penalty. Is the homicide rate lower in states that don't have the death penalty? No, it's not. In fact, it's usually higher.
Deterrence would also say that person, when they're about to do the thing, would be able to evaluate that. So you're sitting there and you're like, well, I'm about to steal this purse, but if I steal this purse, then the 3 strikes law may be applied to me. So the assumption that not only what you said, that it's your own life, but that you're actually thinking about the deterrent nature while you're doing that thing.
Right. The cost benefit analysis calculation. And here, taking us back to my first point, look, Mike Schmidt, the JD who has a job and all these things, I do cost benefit analyses, not even thinking about it all the time for every decision I make. But the person who's in a situation where they're snatching purses is not that person. They are not going through life. And then here's the third one where I was this progressive DA. The amount of people in this community who were sold a bill of goods that because I was the DA, people were out on the streets committing crimes because they knew there was a progressive prosecutor and therefore now is the time to commit crimes. As if there's a population of people out there who are dealing with these challenges, who are committing crimes, but they're also reading the Oregonian and they're up on local politics and prosecutor philosophy, right? It's just completely divorced from reality.
Well, I know you said take religion and sports out of it, but I know what you mean in terms of analogies.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is some of the most religious people, they believe in the prison industrial complex. And so when I mentioned, that's not very Christ-like to put people in prison and throw away the key, it's just fascinating to me because it seems like in a religious sense, and I'm not that religious, spiritual maybe, that the thing to do that would be patriotic, Christian, kind, would be to actually talk to each person and figure out what they need and how they can rehabilitate in society. It wouldn't be to be like, y'all are sinners, go to jail.
No. And in fact, if you know your Bible, Jesus actually says, go into the jails, meet with these people, talk with these people, help these people. So it's actually biblical to do that, to go in and have those conversations. it's interesting to me. Religion is funny that way. Sometimes it cuts in one direction, sometimes it cuts in the other. Because I've met very religious people who are very anti-death penalty, right? Which makes sense for some religious. And then I've met religious people who are very pro-death penalty, which makes a lot less sense to me. But I guess maybe they're Old Testament religious. But, you know, I've also seen a lot of people who are very religious, believe a lot in restorative justice, believe a lot in forgiveness. Being the DA is such a privilege for so many reasons, but one of the reasons was I got to see human beings going through the most unimaginable human tragedies that anybody can consider. And I saw how people handled that. And to have people come to me and say, Mike, you know, we had 2 parents who lost a son, and they asked if instead of prosecuting the person that murdered their son, if we had a restorative justice program that we could put him in. And it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind. The human capacity for forgiveness and for thinking through this is very inspiring. And a lot of times that comes for some people from a religious perspective. So religion's a funny thing. It can cut both ways. It can be the fire and brimstone and the retribution and the punishment, but it can just as easily be focused on love and forgiveness and healing.
Mm-hmm. You've had some time away from elected office.
Yeah, it's been very, speaking of healing.
How has your perspective changed on everything, either on, on politics, on justice?
Yeah. My criminal justice philosophies have not changed. I'm not shook from where I was in believing in the things I did. And like I said, I think the moral arc is long and we are headed towards this. The United States is not going to forever be an outlier in this area. There are too many good people that are working on these things.
Will the United States always disavow science or facts?
I mean, I think that's something that is going to have a reckoning. I'm hopeful that it's going to have a reckoning because, in all of the different areas, we see the CDC and explosive diarrhea. It's like, when are we going to learn our lesson? Maybe we can. That
wasn't on my bingo card talking about explosive diarrhea today.
Yeah, well, there you go. So, on the criminal justice philosophy, I'm not changed. What always drove me was looking for research, looking into seeing what is actually achieving outcomes and then pursuing those programs. So my approach to criminal justice is much more like the scientific method than it is, some sort of philosophical being. I'm like, show me what works, prove to me that it works, makes the community more safe. Then I'm going to be on board with that. And I think if we could just get to that level, we'd be in a better place. Politics, on the other hand, I get asked frequently, what are you going to run for next? What's the next thing going to be? And all this kind of stuff. And it was a very bruising experience for me personally, but for my family. Multiple times we had to evacuate my house. I was constantly under death threats throughout my entire tenure. There's trauma that my children are still dealing with because of that. Having your face put on billboards all around town gave people license not only online to act like trolls, but in person.
And billboards on cars.
Driving around and showing up at public gatherings. It gave people this weird license to not think of me as a human being, to think of me as like a cartoon character and come up to me in restaurants and say horrible things in front of my family, or come up to me in the grocery store and say horrible things. And it's a big sacrifice to take on. And I don't think that's true of every elected official, to be honest. I don't. I think it's of people who are trying to change things. They're the ones who really take the brunt of that kind of reaction. And it's a hard calling to take on. So if I was ever going to get back involved in politics again, it would be because I believed that I was in a position to help change things and that I was willing to do that. But I am much more aware of the personal cost, not only to me, but to the people around me of that decision. And that weighs heavily on me. It also was very disheartening to see a community like this one, where we're one of the most progressive places supposedly in the country, to be so easily tricked back into this old tough on crime, is going to solve our problems way of thinking. I mean, we are, and this is factual, one of the most educated populaces per capita in the country. And yet it was so easy to paint a picture that somehow restorative justice, or somehow a program that was helping clear people's records, or somehow a treatment court that had amazing results were responsible for the challenges, the real challenges.
And or what you alluded to earlier, that you were responsible for all of the people who did drugs and all of the houseless people.
Yeah, and the number of people that actually believed that, or believed it enough, was pretty disheartening to me. That politics is a lot about vibes and not a lot about facts, and it's a little bit crazy making, to be honest. When you're sitting there trying to have a conversation with somebody and they're saying crime's never been as bad as it has ever been, and under you it's been the worst it's ever been, and for me to say, well, can we look at crime, like the actual objective crime rates, like, because they're down, right? Our auto theft intervention that we developed a task force, auto theft was at the lowest it had been since 2016. If you would have done a poll in this community at the end of my tenure of whether or not auto theft was up or down, you would have seen the majority of people believing it was up.
There's also programs that were not implemented well or correctly that somehow also
landed on, Yeah, no, I mean, Measure 110. Measure 110. I believe in drug decriminalization. I do. I'm not shook from that belief. I think that addiction is a brain disease, and that you have to treat it like that. I think punishing a disease would be like punishing diabetes. Like, hey, you got diabetes? Well, you're on probation now. If you eat a donut, we're going to put you in jail. Like, we would think that was absurd. Yet for addiction, that's what we still do. And that's when I say that we're going to look back someday at our criminal justice interventions and liken them to like brain lobotomies. We treat addiction and mental health and these things as if we can punish our way out of them. That if we just subject you to more trauma or more punishment, then the addiction will go away. It's witchcraft. It's voodoo.
So I'll ask you the main question, which is, why do Americans trust punishment more than rehabilitation? What do you think the answer is to that?
I think there is something culturally about the United States. Our roots, penitentiary was born, I mean, we weren't the first in the world to have penitentiaries, but, that philosophy of putting people in judge, making them into prison, making them penitent, they're not allowed to speak, and that will work. Like, it's deeply ingrained in the country's formation and roots. And then you add slavery into the mix. And you look at how our criminal justice system has evolved around slavery and racism, which is deeply ingrained in the roots of this country. And when I was touring the Angola prison, used to be a slave plantation. You drive through there today and you could leave with the impression it's still a slave plantation. There are white guys on horseback with rifles slung over their legs, and there are black men in the fields toiling all day. That's what Angola prison looks like today. So slavery, racism, these things are all deeply ingrained in our criminal justice system and in our philosophies, unfortunately. And I think that unlike places like Norway, where I was talking to people and the population, their criminal justice system is wildly supported and popular over there. Like, they've done polling on it. People really like it. They support rehabilitation. They want people to come back into their community as community members. We don't have that here. So I think there are some cultural headwinds that are just deeply ingrained and baked into our criminal philosophy in this country that hopefully someday we take on. But I think it's in our roots.
Well, thank you. It's time for our fun game or fun segment called Why Is It Like This? Should I go first, or do you want to go first?
You go first. I've been talking a lot.
Okay. So why is it like this? I'm going to say today, why is it like this? Waiting on hold. So you wait on hold, you call a number, and they say, first of all, they say your call is very important to us. So if my call was so important, why wouldn't you be picking up? And then the other thing is they tell you, okay, someone will be with you right away. There's that. Similar. There's also, we'll be with you in a moment. And I don't think 45 minutes or an hour or 2 hours is a moment at all. So maybe just be more realistic. Like, we'll be with you in an hour, or we'll be with you in 2 hours, or go about your day, do your laundry, do your work.
Yeah.
So why is it like this? Promising that my call is important and promising that they'll be with me in a moment.
Yeah. I like the ones that they say, hey, if you want, you can hang up and we'll call you back.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, there you go.
Yeah.
It's getting at that.
I like that too, but then what if they call you back when you're not available?
Well, see, there you go. Then you could put them on hold and tell them that their call is very important.
That's actually that's really funny. You could pick up the phone and say, I'll be with you in a moment.
Yeah. All right. My why is it like this? Neckties.
Yeah.
Neckties.
Please tell us more.
Why? What? So my understanding, and I'm not a fashion historian, but my understanding is that neckties came out of this idea that the aristocracy developed, that rich people developed at some point in our history, so that they could tie a fancy napkin around their neck, so when they needed to dab their mouth or they spilled on themselves or something. And it became this, wealthy people do it, so now the lower class does it, and then the lower class does it, and the lower class does it. And so I don't know how many years, 100 years, 200 years, I don't know how long we've been doing neckties. But now I have to wear a necktie that strangles me all day. And by the way, I can't use it as a napkin. That would be absurd. If I got stuff on my tie, now I need a new tie. Like, why? Why are we doing neckties? They're not comfortable.
It's a really good one.
And they don't serve any kind of function. They're purely decorative fabric that don't even have a usefulness.
It's a good one. What about clip-on ties?
I mean, the whole tie thing, tie thing. I don't care if it's, it's not the tied part that gets me. It's the piece of colorful fabric hanging underneath my chin that makes no sense to me.
What gets me is when people wear a full suit every day, even if they're not going to court or a funeral. They're just sitting casually and they're wearing a full suit.
Yeah. That used to be the expectation in the district attorney's office. When I was the DA, I relaxed that and said, hey, if you're not in court, there's not an expectation that you need to wear a full suit. Business casual is completely
unless it's
fine.
a Texas tuxedo.
Yeah, there you go. And my understanding, though, is that the decorum has been ratcheted back up so that they can sit in suits all day.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you for being great in the community. Thanks for being fun, caring. If folks want to find you, or not find you at your house,
please don't.
But find out more information about your podcast and your Substack, can you tell us?
Yeah. You can find us at www.schmidtshowpdx.com, where you've been on my podcast, you've been a guest, and we have others. We try to talk. Schmidt Show came out of the negative attack campaign against me. And so, I lost the DA campaign, but I said, hey, that's $1 million worth of advertising for my future podcast.
And you reclaimed it, and nevertheless, she persisted.
Yeah, that's right. And so the idea is to tell good stories about people doing good work in this community that we can be proud of. And we also try to get into some of the political issues of the day. So go on Substack, find us there. And then, follow, subscribe, reach out with comments, and I really appreciate it.
Help us go viral.
Yeah, help us go viral. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the end of this episode of All American Why. If you made it this far, congratulations. You're officially an excessive thinker too. If something today made you laugh, cringe, or reconsider everything you thought you understood about this country, good. That's the point. Subscribe, rate, review, and share All American Why wherever you get your podcasts, including on YouTube. Or don't. It's still a free country for now. You can find me, Michael Jonas, on social media or at allamericanwhy.com, where we're building community for people who still give a damn. Original music by Renezra and Views. Audio editing by Kyle Gilmer of Residual Audio. Until next time, Keep your curiosity loud, your optimism spiteful, and your democracy under constant surveillance. This is All American Why. Thank you for listening.
All American why? All American why? Ask yourself the American why.
Nailed it? Do it again, or is it good? Okay.